Okay, so ready to dive into Dostoevsky again.
Mhm.
This time we're tackling The Gambler. And let me tell you, this one is a wild ride.
It really is.
Yeah.
And we're going straight to the heart of it with these excerpts, really digging into the psychology of obsession, the high-stakes world of the casino.
And speaking of casinos, I mean, right off the bat, we're thrown into this world, right? The roulette wheel, the frenzy of it all. And our narrator is right there in the thick of it.
Yeah, you can practically hear the clatter of the chips and feel that tension.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting is how Dostoevsky uses the setting, right, to reflect the inner turmoil of the narrator.
Totally. You get that sense of being on edge, conflicted even.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, he despises the gambling. I mean, he calls it flunkyishness at one
Right.
point, right?
Yeah, he does. But then on the other hand, he can't seem to tear himself away. And it's like, that's classic Dostoevsky, right?
Yeah.
That duality, that pull between our darker impulses and what society expects of us.
It's like this constant internal struggle.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found really interesting, and tell me if you see this too, it seems like he's more willing to gamble when it's not his own money on the line. Almost like it's easier to justify the risk if it's for someone else.
Absolutely. It's like he can only indulge in the chaos when it's masked as this, like, noble act, which of course makes you question his true motivations, right? Is it really altruism or is it something else driving him?
Right, exactly. And then just when you think you're starting to get a handle on the narrator, we're introduced to Polina.
Oh, Paulina, talk about a complex character.
She's captivating, frustrating, even cruel at times, especially in the way she treats the narrator. What do you make of their dynamic?
Well, I think you have to look at it within the context of the society they're living in, right? Especially for women like Polina. She's essentially trapped, her options are limited, and then you bring de Grier into the mix, this enigmatic Frenchman, their relationship is. Well, it's a whole other layer of complicated.
Oh, absolutely. Talk about a power imbalance. You can feel it in every interaction they have.
Exactly, and it makes you question Polina's motivations. Is she being manipulative out of malice? Or is it a survival mechanism in a world where she has very little control? Dostoevsky doesn't give us easy answers, does he?
He really doesn't.
Mhm.
And it's not just Polina and de Grier, is it? This theme of power dynamics, it seems to permeate every relationship in the novel. Men and women, the wealthy and the indebted, even individuals trying to exert control over something as unpredictable as chance.
Exactly. It's that constant push and pull, and that, my friend, is what makes Dostoevsky so brilliant. He forces us to confront those uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about the ways in which we navigate these complex power structures.
You know, just when we think we're starting to unravel things a bit, Dostoevsky throws in this whole other wrench into the works, and that wrench is the grandmother.
Oh, yeah. The grandmother's entrance is anything but subtle, right? She just explodes onto the scene full of life after everyone's convinced she's on her deathbed.
It's almost comical. You know, if it weren't so tragic, it would be hilarious. Especially the way she just steamrolls into that casino, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding around her.
Right, and it's that obliviousness, that almost childlike fascination she has with roulette that really highlights the absurdity of it all.
It's like she's this innocent caught in a den of very cunning wolves.
Exactly. And it forces us to confront the hypocrisy of the family. I mean, they're also concerned with appearances, with their social standing, but then they're perfectly willing to exploit their own grandmother's weakness for gambling to try to solve their financial woes.
It's Dostoevsky at his finest, isn't it?
Yeah.
Exposing those uncomfortable truths about human nature. But it's not just the family dynamic that shifts when the grandmother arrives. It's like other characters we've met, they come into sharper focus too.
Yeah, like the General Mademoiselle Blanche, for instance.
Exactly. Suddenly their little game is thrown into this whole new light. Right?
It's like their true colors start to show through, don't they? The general with his eye on the inheritance and Mademoiselle Blanche trying to secure her own future.
All about self-preservation, isn't it? And the lengths people will go to when they feel desperate. But speaking of desperation, we've got to talk about the narrator's gambling. It takes some pretty intense turns in these excerpts.
It really does. I mean, one minute he's at the lowest of lows, ready to give up on everything. Then the next he's on this incredible winning streak.
It's like watching someone ride a roller coaster, you know? You're never quite sure which direction it's going to go next.
And that's the thing about obsession, isn't it? That feeling of being on the edge, of not being in control, and the seductive power of it all. Because when he's winning, the narrator feels invincible, like he's finally cracked the code.
Which makes what happens with Polina even more heartbreaking.
Oh, you mean when he lays all his winnings at her feet? Yeah, talk about a gesture.
It's like he's so convinced that this is it, right? This is the grand gesture, the thing that will finally win her over. But instead,
It backfires spectacularly.
she rejects him.
Yeah.
And not just politely, but with this coldness that just makes your heart ache for the narrator.
Hmm.
It's like she crushes him.
Yeah, and it's that rejection, that utter humiliation that really highlights the depth of his delusion. Because up until that point, he's so blinded by his own desires, by this fantasy he's constructed around her, that he can't see what's right in front of him.
And yet, even though we as readers can see how misguided he is, there's still this part of you that wonders, why? Why reject him so completely?
Right. Especially with the promise of financial security hanging in the balance, it just doesn't seem rational, does it? And yet, maybe that's the point. Maybe Dostoevsky is trying to show us that human emotions, they don't always follow the rules of logic.
It's messy and complicated,
Yeah.
like real life. And speaking of messy and complicated, let's not forget about that little encounter the narrator has with Astley toward the end of these excerpts.
Oh yeah, that's a curious one. All of a sudden, we're getting these hints about Polina's past, her connection to de Griers, even whispers of illness. It's like Dostoevsky throws in this whole other layer of intrigue just when we thought we were starting to get a handle on things.
It's like he's peeling back the layers, revealing just enough to pique our curiosity, but not enough to give us any real answers.
And just when you think you understand a character's motivations, he pulls you back in, makes you question everything you thought you knew.
It's like we're suddenly seeing Polina through new eyes, right? And it makes you re-examine everything, their whole relationship.
Right, like we thought we had her figured out, at least to some extent.
Yeah.
And then Dostoevsky pulls this. It's masterful, really. It's like he's holding up a mirror not just to the characters, but to us as readers as well.
It's like he's saying, don't get too comfortable with your assumptions. And that's what makes The Gambler so hard to put down. Because just when you think you're starting to grasp the intricacies of the plot, he throws in another curveball.
And it's not just the plot, is it? It's the characters themselves. They're so complex, so deeply flawed, and yet you can't help but feel this strange empathy for them, even when they're making terrible decisions.
And speaking of terrible decisions, we end with the narrator right back where he started, at the roulette wheel.
After everything he's been through, the losses, the humiliation, the crushing realization that he's lost Polina, probably for good. You'd think he'd have had enough, right?
You would, but then again, that's the thing about obsession, isn't it? It doesn't always follow the rules of logic.
No, it certainly doesn't. And that's what Dostoevsky leaves us with, that lingering question of whether the narrator, or any of us for that matter, can ever truly break free from those destructive cycles.
And that's a question that feels as relevant today as it did back when The Gambler was first published. Because haven't we all felt that pull, that allure of something that might not be good for us, but we can't seem to resist?
Whether it's a gamble, a relationship, an idea that we just can't shake, is that constant struggle between our better judgment and those deeper impulses. And I think that's why Dostoevsky's work continues to resonate with readers even today, because he wasn't afraid to explore those darker corners of the human experience, to hold up a mirror to our flaws and say, this is us.
He's certainly given us a lot to unpack today, hasn't it? And I have a feeling we'll be revisiting these themes again and again in future deep dives. So until then, keep those wheels spinning, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world of literature.